The truck had one door that didn't close right, a check engine light that never turned off, and 300,000 miles of dust in its bones, and Daniel Reyes loved it more than anything he owned, because it was the only thing he owned. He pulled into the marina parking lot that morning with his daughter's booster seat still buckled in the back and a leather portfolio of drawings on the passenger seat, praying the old engine wouldn't stall in front of the crowd gathering near the auction tents. He didn't know that in less than an hour, a man who had just mocked him in front of 40 strangers would watch him sign the winning bid on a $90 million yacht. If you believe in second chances, in quiet dignity, and in stories where kindness wins in the end, hit that like button, drop a comment telling us where you're watching from, share this with someone who needs a little hope today, and subscribe to Kindness Corner so you never miss a story like this one. Daniel had been a single father for 6 years, ever since his wife Maria passed away, leaving him with a 2-year-old named Sophie and a mortgage he could barely keep up with. He worked as a marine architect, designing yacht interiors for a small boutique firm, and though his talent was undeniable, his bank account rarely reflected it. He drove that battered truck to every job site, every school pickup, every grocery run, because pride had never fed his daughter and a new vehicle would have. That morning, he'd come to the marina not to buy anything, but to deliver final blueprints to a client docked near the auction, a superyacht called Serenity, which he had spent the last 4 years secretly designing every interior detail of, from the cabin woodwork to the owner's suite skylight, without ever once telling anyone at Sophie's school or at the park that his hands had shaped something worth $90 million. He parked beside a row of gleaming European sports cars, and the moment he stepped out in his paint-stained work jacket, he felt the stares. A man in a tailored navy suit, silver watch catching the sun, looked him up and down and let out a short, cruel laugh. This was Preston Hale, the CEO of a shipping conglomerate, a man known in yachting circles for buying vessels the way other people bought shoes, and for never missing a chance to remind everyone else of their place beneath him. Preston gestured toward Daniel's truck and said loud enough for the gathering crowd to hear that some people really shouldn't bring their garbage trucks to a place like this, that the marina had valet for a reason, and that Daniel should move along before he embarrassed himself further. A few nearby brokers chuckled along, not because it was funny, but because laughing at Preston's jokes was good for business. Daniel felt his face burn, the old familiar shame rising in his chest, the same shame he'd carried since Maria died, and he'd had to explain to Sophie why other kids had 2 parents and she only had one, why other kids had new sneakers and she had hand-me-downs, why some doors in this world seemed built only for people who already had everything. He almost turned around. He almost got back into that truck and drove away, the way he had 100 times before when the world reminded him where it thought he belonged. But he thought of Sophie, asleep at her grandmother's house that morning, and how he'd promised her that hard work eventually meant something, that a person's worth was never measured by the paint on their truck. So instead of leaving, he walked past Preston without a word and made his way toward the auction tent, blueprints tucked under his arm, his heart hammering with a mixture of humiliation and quiet, stubborn resolve. Inside the tent, the auctioneer was preparing to open bidding on the yacht Serenity, and Daniel realized with a jolt that the very vessel he had spent 4 sleepless years designing was the one about to be sold. The broker who represented the shipyard spotted him and rushed over, greeting him not as a stranger but as the man whose craftsmanship had made international headlines in boating magazines, whose name was quietly attached to some of the most celebrated yacht interiors on the East Coast. The broker asked, within earshot of several onlookers, whether Daniel would finally reveal himself as the designer during the unveiling, since the shipyard had kept his identity private at his own request, back when he chose to protect his daughter from the spotlight rather than chase recognition. Daniel simply nodded, overwhelmed, unsure how any of this connected to the mockery he'd swallowed minutes earlier. What no one in that tent knew, what Preston Hale certainly didn't know, was that Daniel wasn't only the designer. 2 years earlier, a foundation had been established anonymously in Maria's name, funded by royalties from Daniel's design patents and a modest inheritance she'd left behind, quietly invested and grown by a financial advisor who believed fiercely in Daniel's talent. That foundation, structured structured as a private maritime trust, was the anonymous backer behind the winning bid that day, a bid meant to preserve Serenity as a floating training vessel for underprivileged kids interested in marine trades, kids who reminded Daniel of himself at 17, kids who never had anyone believe a boat could be their bridge to a bigger life. When the auctioneer called for final bids and the trust's paddle rose one last decisive time, sealing the sale, the tent fell into a stunned hush, and Daniel Reyes, in his paint-stained jacket, stepped forward to sign the paperwork as the trust's founder and namesake. Preston's smug expression collapsed into something between disbelief and dread as he watched the man he'd humiliated minutes earlier shake hands with the shipyard's owner, as he heard whispers rippling through the crowd identifying Daniel as both the yacht's designer and its new owner. He tried to approach, stammering an apology about not knowing who Daniel was, but Daniel only looked at him with a calm, unshaken steadiness and said that it shouldn't have mattered who he was, that kindness was supposed to be unconditional, not something reserved for people who arrived in the right kind of car. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. The weight of his words did the work, settling over the crowd far more powerfully than any yacht ever could. Word of what happened at the marina spread through the small coastal town within days, not as gossip about a CEO's embarrassment, but as a story people told their children about judging too quickly, about the quiet strength of a man who worked with his hands and never once stopped believing he was worth more than his circumstances suggested. Sophie, now finally old enough to understand a little of what her father had built, would sometimes stand on the deck of Serenity while local kids from the program climbed the rigging and learned to read the wind, and she would tell anyone who asked that her dad drove an old truck because he was saving something more important than appearances, he was saving a future for people like them. If this story moved something in you, if it reminded you that dignity doesn't come with a price tag, please take a moment to like this video and share it with someone who needs to hear that kindness always finds its way back around. And before we go, we'd love it if you could comment the word Serenity below, just so we know this story reached your heart the way it reached ours. Because sometimes the man they laugh at in the parking lot is the very same man who ends up building the boat that carries everyone else's dreams. And if there's one thing Daniel Reyes proved that day, it's that real worth was never about what you drive, but about what you're willing to give.